Welcome to Connecting Citizens to Science. I am your host, Dr. Kim Ozano, and this is a podcast where we explore global health and development. And today we're bringing you the first of a special two-part finale to our gender justice mini-series. When Ishrat and I worked together on the final episode with our guests today, we realized that there was a lot of content that needed to be shared, so we decided to make it a two-parter. So the theme that we're going to be exploring in both of the episodes is understanding gender as a complex social system, especially during times of crisis.
When I talk about gender, I talk about it as a social system and ultimately how it impacts our health outcomes and health systems.
Throughout this series, and again in today's discussion, it's been clear that gender isn't something separate from conflict, pandemics, or economic instability. It is deeply woven throughout them. And when systems are under pressure, gender is often the first thing that is simplified, sidelined, or treated as an add-on, even though it shapes every part of our lives. In part one, we stay with the foundations. We explore what gender really means when we treat it as a social system, why it is layered, contextual, and dynamic, and how it interacts with power, identity, and lived experience. And then in part two, we move on to the practical elements, the approaches for working more responsively and ethically for gender justice. So before we begin, let me introduce our wonderful guests. We have Dr. Rosemary Morgan, who is an associate professor at the Department of International Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She is recognized as a specialist in gender analysis and health systems research and has published extensively in this field. We're also joined by Salima Sara Kabir. Salima is a transdisciplinary mixed method researcher and educator based at the BRAC James P. Grant School of Public Health in Bangladesh. Her research spans gender, health systems and policy, digital cultures, and social justice. And of course, my wonderful co-host for this series, Ishrat Jahan, who is a research fellow at the Center of Gender and Sexual and Reproductive Health at BRAC James P. Grant School of Public Health in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So here is part one of our finale. Enjoy the episode. Ishrat, here we are coming to the end of this gender justice series. We've learned so much already, and after each of these episodes, I go away thinking so much more about gender and how I could apply it in my work. Perhaps you could set us up. What are we going to be talking about today?
Thank you, Kim. It's really nice to be here, and I am excited for today because today we'll be talking about how we can think about gender research and actions moving forward in a world that's becoming increasingly defined by crisis. So I recently read a UN Women report that came in The Guardian that was saying that gender rights is facing stagnation and even regression in some contexts. And we can see the causes around us. There's increasing conflict, there's unprecedented aid cuts, and of course, there are various kinds of national or global crises like the pandemic. So I think it's important for us to start off with asking our guests, how can we think about gender more deeply? And let's start with you, Rosemary.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. One thing I've come to realize or learn is when you say the word gender, it means different things to different people. And this is often very context specific as well. Sometimes when you say the word gender, people automatically think women and girls. It means women's rights, feminism. Other times, particularly in some high-income countries, they think it means gender identity, particularly around transgender individuals and rights for transgender individuals. And that's a very big topic in the United States at the moment. Others think it's very binary, that you can either only be a man or a woman and nothing else. None of these explanations on their own are correct. I mean, they're all part of understanding what gender is, but none of them on their own are correct. And when I talk about gender, I talk about it as a social system and ultimately how it impacts our health outcomes and health systems experience and outcomes. Thinking about how gender operates as a social system, for example, that organizes power, roles, resources in society, how it operates on different levels at the same time, influencing how we organize our society in terms of social norms, institutions, structures, at all levels, families, households, communities, economies, states. It's like embedded in all of these different levels. And it also encompasses our interpersonal relationships, how we interact with one another, and also how it forms our individual identities and values, how we identify. It's different from, but related to biological sex.
What really stands out for me here is how gender is something that we live inside. It's not just a label or a category. It's a system of norms, expectations, and power that is shaping our everyday decisions. And if we don't see that system clearly, it becomes very hard to change it.
It is socially constructed, meaning it's something that is negotiated by individuals and societies. What it means to be a man or woman in one context is going to be different from what it means to be in another context. It also changes over time. What it meant to be a man or woman 50 years ago, very different from today, right? And then again, it changes across context. It also interacts with other social stratifiers or other social identities like race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability. So my experiences as a white woman are going to be very different from a Black woman or Hispanic woman in the United States or Canada, for example. All of these dynamics affect our exposure to health risks, patterns of illness, distribution of health resource, and ultimately, I think it's really important that we think about gender as this social system and how it sort of organizes in society, how it impacts our identities, relationships, and the structures in which we live and work and exist.
I think that's a really simplified yet holistic way to put it. I think what you're saying is that it's important to recognize the complexity of gender and gender as a system in itself, and then how it interacts with other systems, how power becomes shaped within it and by it, to be able to understand it more deeply to begin with.
And the one word that you really picked up on, I think is important, is the complexity of it. And I know we're going to go to talk about sort of tools and resources, how to explore it, but it's not straightforward. It's not an easy thing to integrate into our research, monitoring, evaluations, interventions. It really takes a sort of a systematic, holistic approach to be able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Salima, how do you think of this idea of understanding gender as a system in itself?
Thank you, Ishrat, and thank you for having me as well. I think Rosemary's already put it really succinctly and really beautifully. Because when I was thinking about the fact that gender is layered, every time we sort of start doing our work and start thinking about gender discretely, it becomes really difficult to think about gender outside of like the power structures and systems, outside of all of these other identifiers. Again, thinking of gender as a system becomes really, really important because, as you know, I've done a lot of work around like health systems, community-based action, community-based research. And in that, oftentimes the way in which gender is looked at and understood is very siloed. It's like, oh, well, and women or and an XYZ gender. And that's just the sort of, it's a sort of like addendum. But every time we start looking at health systems more holistically, it becomes very evident that gender is embedded in every single layer of work that we try to do. And so it becomes really important to think about that. And then I think intersectionality becomes really, really important because when we think about the different identities that we embody and the different ways, especially in a country like Bangladesh, class becomes like a very key sort of determinant, making sure that we're looking at poverty and, like living outside of poverty, even within those who are above the immediate poverty line. There's so many different layers to which their lived experiences impact the way in which they enact gender, in the ways in which they're allowed to, in the ways in which they understand how they can live and act. And as Rosemary was saying as well, it's very dynamic. It's so fluid and it's always changing. And it's very much contextual. It's very based on so many different like diverse factors that it's really hard to pin down. So I think it's just remembering that gender is complex and is layered and it's situated in many different things.
Salima, I really love this point about gender being layered and constantly shifting. It really echoes what we've heard throughout the series and how deeply context matters. And also how gender is always lived locally. It's shaped by place, identity, and environment.
I think we began with a sort of a trick question. There's no right answer to it, right? Because I think what we often do is we don't appreciate the intricacy or the complexity of the systems within which we live. And increasingly, there's a drive to simplify or to just, flatten so that we understand them better. And at least in my limited experience as a researcher, as someone who's interacted with communities, oftentimes it's easier for the kinds of evaluation tools we have or the research tools we have if we can categorize or put things into boxes and make it very simple for our reports and our donor agenda.
The complexities for me sound almost a bit unwieldy. They're large and complex, and there's so many, Rosemary and Salima, as you were talking, all these frameworks that have come across have popped in my head. And I think let's go back to the basics. And we're hearing that gender is often an add-on rather than something that's considered. And as soon as we get into crisis, it ends up being pushed aside. So I guess the question to both of you is, how can we make sure that gender's not just an add-on, that it's thought about in all the work we do, from our projects and donors right down to the communities that we work with directly?
I think it's very true that gender is often treated as an add-on. You see it as sort of an additional separate question as opposed to something that is integrated across questions. And I think in order to make sure it is integrated in all of our work and everything that we do need to take both sort of a gender mainstreaming approach and sort of gender integration approach. So gender mainstreaming is thinking about how do we establish it or integrate it into our own organizations, institutions, our own practices through, making sure we have established policies or gender policies in our organization, making sure we have policies like sexual harassment policies, right? It's or equitable opportunities, equitable pay. I think of gender mainstreaming a lot as practicing what we preach. So how do we turn the lens inwards on what we are doing? And then gender mainstreaming creates an enabling environment for gender integration, which is integrating gender into our programs, interventions, research. And there's different strategies and tools to do that. And then we often use sort of frameworks and tools to do that in a very systematic way. I've heard a lot that in the past that, in order to take a gender lens to our work, especially research or monitoring and evaluation, all you need to do is disaggregate your data by sex. And that is not true, because a lot of work we do doesn't include men and women. Sometimes it just includes women. Sometimes it just includes men. So we've done a lot of work of thinking about what is gender data? How do we actually capture this and measure it? Particularly in our MAGE project, which stands for Monitoring and Action for Gender and Equity, which is a partnership between Johns Hopkins University and the Global Financing Facility, which is part of the World Bank. So we've looked at established frameworks and thought, okay, what is gender data? How do we break it down into, for example, sex-specific data, which captures just data for one gender group only, like men or women, sex-desegregated data, which compares things between men and women. Well, and while these data points are important, they're not enough to constitute gender analysis. They're an entry point.
This really resonates with so many projects in global health, the way our tools often push us to simplify things in order to measure them. But what you're both saying is those simplifications can hide the very dynamics that we're trying to understand.
Yeah, the thinking about how then do we integrate a needs, rights, and preferences lens into this. Needs, what are essential needs for particular gender groups like women or men? What rights, what do they have an essential right to? And preferences, what do they prefer? And these are going to be very context specific, which is why we need frameworks and tools. There's another gender dimension, which is thinking about gender equality and systems indicators. And all of these overlap. So gender equality in systems, data, or indicators thinks about how gender power relations manifest as inequities, and then how might that affect the work that we do, right? So they might manifest as an equitable access to resources, which could be a lot of different things: finances, time, education, information, knowledge, inequitable roles and practices and distribution of labor, inequitable norms, beliefs, values, and inequitable decision-making power, autonomy, and sort of rules, both formal and informal. And this, by taking sort of systemic lens like this, we can think about how do we make our work more gender responsive? How do we move from being gender sensitive, where we're just considering gender but not doing anything about it, to gender specific or gender accommodative, where we're actually thinking about how do gender inequities, or how might they affect our work, and how do we modify our work to make sure they don't, so we can achieve our objectives. And then gender transformative, how do we challenge and change harmful gender norms, roles, and relations? So we do really need to use established frameworks and tools to be able to do this in our work.
And that brings us to the end of part 1 of our 2-part finale. And today we've stayed with the foundation. We really took the time to understand gender as a complex social system and explored how those dynamics become visible. In part 2, we're going to build on everything that you've heard so far and move into the practical. We're going to be talking about the approaches that can really help us to work more responsively, more ethically, and more effectively with our communities. It's a continuation of the conversation that you've heard today, but with a focus on action, and it's a really powerful companion to what we've explored today. But for now, thank you for listening, and thank you to our guests for sharing such rich insights, and do join us in part 2.